ARE Podcast, episode number 66.
Welcome to the ARE Podcast. Where it's all about encouraging and inspiring you today so you can fulfill your dream of becoming a licensed architect tomorrow. And now your host, David Doucette.
Hello, and welcome back to another episode of the ARE Podcast, joined once again by our co-host, Eric Corey Freed. Eric, how are you?
I'm fine. Hi, everybody.
Today we have a topic that I think most of us can relate to, and it is afraid to ask questions. We're here to help. And we see this in our own coaching program, and you guys might see it in your own firm as well. So it is a very common fear that not just candidates, but just humans have, afraid to ask questions. And there's probably a few reasons why, or a few reasons behind that. So, Eric, why are we afraid to ask questions?
Yeah, there's this inherent, normal, understandable need that you don't want to look uninformed or silly or dumb. You also, I think there's also this other need, a fear that, well, maybe they already said this, maybe they already explained this. So if I ask now, it'll kind of show that I wasn't really listening because I wasn't, that kind of thing. If you have a tendency to just kind of zone off, you'll probably have more of that kind of reluctance to ask questions. But that feeling that I shouldn't ask is not only a bad decision, but I would also argue is technically a risk for the project.
Well, I think it is fear-based, and I think we if we don't ask the question, we kind of look like we already know, right? So I think by us asking questions, we feel like, oh, we might be a fraud because we should know this. But as we've heard before, you go to any sort of training program or anything, if you have a question, there's plenty of other people that have that same question, so it's not just you're not the only one sort of missing it. So it does seem fear-based, but also ego-based, right? Men, as a stereotype, don't like to ask directions. And thank God for Google Maps now, because we don't have to as much. But we would drive around a block for 3 hours rather than pull into a gas station and ask where something is.
Yeah, there's it's also interesting because on the one hand, you forget that architecture in itself is a mentor-based learning profession. In the old days, we had apprentices, and then they became interns, and then they became emerging professionals. Right? I think that was the evolution. But regardless of what you call folks, the idea is that we are in practice of architecture, that we are continually improving and striving and getting better. In fact, we have a continuing education requirement with our license that insists that we go and learn new things every year, and then we report on it. So all of that is kind of screaming that asking questions is kind of the point. And so I noticed that with my junior staff, they would be very quiet in meetings. Then eventually they got to the point of they would have questions, they would make notes and write them down, and then afterwards they would grill me with questions. I noticed this on the drive back from the meeting I was just getting pummeled with, why did they say that? And why did they say that? And I keep saying, you could have asked that in the meeting. I wish, you should feel comfortable enough to ask that in the meeting. It's a good, especially if they got to a question that I didn't even think of. And I'm like, oh man, I don't know the answer to that. I would have loved to know the answer to that. I wish you had asked it in the meeting. So, you start to realize that there's this almost like amorphous shape of fear, this cloud of fear that was around them that kept them from asking questions that would have given them clarity, probably would have given them the ability to contribute something to that thing they didn't know, and then also would have spurred the conversation. I do this thing in work because my life is spent sitting in workshops, going through very technical, sustainability related information. I do this thing that I call the idea grenade. And the idea grenade is I go, hey, pull the plug and chuck it. Hey, I got a wild idea. What if we were to do blank, and just whatever it is. And I'm not afraid to look dumb because I'm I don't know. I'm too old to worry about that, I think. But I'm genuinely curious about this thing. I have all this talent in the room. Now's the time to ask the question. So there's questions like that of, hey, why couldn't we just, this came up the other day. We're doing a building that has a plenum system, normal traditional suspended ceiling plenum system. And the engineers kept talking about all these problems they had with flexibility. And I said, hey, I got a wacky idea. What if we did, in addition to the plenum system, we also did a raised access floor system? We have the floor to floor height. Couldn't we do that? Or is that, and I said in the room, or is that nuts? And we spent an hour like, no, actually, that might actually lead to something. Let's talk it through. That's the whole point of the meeting, is to ask dumb questions and explore them. Now, there's the difference between that and asking something that's, what is a brick made of? Like, there's those kind of questions, but I don't think anybody would have the urgency to hopefully not ask something that basic. But, I was in a meeting, we were talking about curtain wall details, and the construction manager said, he kept using a lot of acronyms, and he said, well, we're going to do the VMU and then the PMU, and we've left 4 months for that. And I was about to ask, what the hell is a VMU? Because I've got so many acronyms in my brain, I can't keep track. But he was on a roll. He was just talking. And so instead, I just kind of pulled out my phone and just VMU, PMU, construction. And it popped up, oh, that's a visual mock-up and a performance mock-up. And they're two separate things. And for a curtain wall, that makes a lot of sense. So immediately saw that and said, oh, VMU, PMU, right, of course. Hey, aren't we going to need two different VMUs? One for this side of the building and one for this one. And the contractor said, oh, yes, that's true. So I went from having no idea what he's talking about, right, with VMU, PMU, to Googling it in 30 seconds to actually asking a legitimate good question that brought up a good point. So if I had a fear of asking, none of that would have happened. So that's why it's not only bad to be driven by fear, but also could potentially be risky in terms of the project.
Two things you mentioned are two words that jumped out that I think are at the root of our being afraid to ask questions. Number one is fear, and number two is comfortable or being uncomfortable. And that comes down to, the safe space, right? And we say that on our coaching calls, this is a safe space. And it's interesting because obviously, for example, your staff in these meetings, they did not feel it was a safe space for them to ask the questions, right? They just didn't. But when they get you alone afterwards, to them, that's a safe space, and they feel comfortable asking those questions. So it's almost like we need to get better at feeling like these in front of people, not feeling that's an unsafe space. It is a safe space, conference rooms, and because we don't want to get laughed at, we don't want to get ridiculed, any of that stuff. And sometimes, we can't be driven by that fear, but I think the core of that safe space. So, for example, your junior staff, how can they get comfortable in a meeting like that can be very intimidating to junior staff? We've all been there, but how do you get over that and be like, okay, I want to ask this question?
There's a few ways. But that's a great question. I should also say my staff now, they're not afraid of it. They're not afraid of anything, and they're bringing up amazing points all the time of stuff that I just didn't even think of. That's why they're in the meeting, right? That's why I wanted them there. Right?
Well, and they're more comfortable, right? They got comfortable, right? They increased their safe space.
But I have a very smart technical team that were hired because they're smart and technical and brilliant, but. When I had my residential practice, for example, I had, people that had just graduated. They were young. They didn't know what they didn't know. So almost out of politeness, they didn't want to ask anything. And so I would say to them on the drive there, look, if you have any questions, you can ask them in the meeting, or if you're uncomfortable doing that, write them down and we'll go through them. And sure enough, they would always opt for that second one, because on the drive back, I would just get, grilled with questions, which was great because that's how they learn. But slowly they started getting more comfortable, especially as they started getting their head into the project. So usually on the first meeting, they wouldn't ask anything. The second or third meeting, now they know the people in the room, they get a sense of the personalities, they knew the roles of who's doing what. Now they're much more comfortable to ask. The other thing to do is oftentimes we'll give them a job, right? Would you capture the meeting minutes? because I'm presenting, so I can't write anything down. So can you just capture the meeting minutes? This is something we all do from time to time. And capture the meeting minutes, of course, they're going to have questions about. They used an acronym I never heard before, or they alluded to the flux capacitor. What is that? Or whatever weird thing. We live in an industry that's very technical, that has a ton of these acronyms, that has a ton of these interesting, weird words that aren't in normal society. And they're just trying to capture it all. So of course there's going to be things they don't know. But I would like them to almost think of themselves as a court reporter, where they would say, "I'm sorry, I didn't hear you. Can you say that again?" But again, they just needed to kind of dip their foot in the water, and then kind of get deeper in the water and get more used to it. And then, once they're kind of deep on a project team and they know the players, then they're much more likely to do it. But giving them that assignment is a great gateway into knowing that they are responsible for capturing those meeting minutes, and therefore they have to ask questions, and it kind of gets them over themselves and over their own fears.
Hopefully, like to your point, they have a good boss or mentor, and they meaning you guys were talking to. And you're right, Eric. I think that initial meeting, whatever sort of that initial client meeting is, we as sort of, let's say, junior staff tend to be quieter, right? And we just let our boss handle it. And then the next meeting we have with them, then we, like you said, we get to know everyone in the room. We get more comfortable. We understand the situation. We can start to ask questions. So one thing I want to make clear is we should have a boss or supervisor or firm owner, whoever is above us, should be providing this mentorship. Because I'm sure there's people listening where their bosses aren't like that. And their bosses probably don't want them asking questions in meetings, sadly. Or they've piped up in a meeting before and the boss is like, "What are you doing? You're not supposed to talk in the meetings." Unfortunately, that stuff does exist, but it's not normal. In any architect worth their salt would be more than happy to mentor their junior staff and encourage questions, just like you said, Eric, and would prep you along the way or over the way to the meeting, or basically make you feel comfortable, right? You should feel comfortable with your boss or your superior, whoever it might be. So I think some of that fear comes from just past experiences and maybe bosses that haven't been so great.
Yeah. Our architecture, in as much as it's always been a mentoring profession traditionally, and one of, mentoring and tutoring and encouraging and all that other stuff, you also get into situations in firms where there are people that were made to be managers of people, not because they aspired to be great managers, but they were promoted to become managers of humans because they were supposed to be. They've done their job, they've done it well, and their reward was now you get to manage people. So oftentimes we're putting people in management roles that aren't necessarily wanting to be managers, know anything about management. They could be very talented as architects for other reasons, but not necessarily as management. And one of the things that I tell people throughout my firm is that to really be a great manager is to be a great mentor. In fact, I don't even like that word manager. I'd rather say my job is to eliminate the obstacles that are in your way so you can do your job. I hired you because you're talented. So, you tell me what you need to do that. And it's elevated our conversations, it's elevated our relationship, it's elevated our trust to get to the point where they know they can feel comfortable asking questions in meetings because they've been empowered to do that. And I've never in 35 years, had someone ask a legitimate question that they legitimately just, "What is that again?" and gotten laughed at. That's never happened. I mean, surely we joke and stuff like, I tell jokes all day long, but that fear that people have of like, I'm afraid to answer the question is an unfounded fear. There's no need to feel that way. In fact, when I do my workshops with clients, I'll do a 4-hour workshop with a client, and you've seen this slide because we also do it in the coaching. At the very front, I set out kind of the rules of engagement. And the first one is, if you have a question, just ask. There are no dumb questions. And I say that out loud because I want the client and all their staff and all the stakeholders to feel free to do this. Well, that also goes for the consultants in the room and my staff in the room and everybody else. Like we're here to learn. So asking questions is part of it. And I know that I've done a good job explaining something when I get a lot of questions, right? Because it's spurred, it's spurred thoughts in their head of, hey, like you said this, like, I wonder, could we do that? The quality of the questions, as the quality of the questions improves, I've known that I've done a better job at even presenting. So I love questions, and I'd love for you to ask them, and I'd love for you to feel comfortable asking them.
Especially if we are going to job meetings with our boss, that is because we are contributing member to the team, right? And oftentimes we're the one with the boots on the ground. We're the one working on CAD, or we're working the nuts and bolts. So I would imagine our boss would appreciate questions in the meeting while the client is there and the team is there, because that's going to help us, rather than afterwards we ask our boss, well, what was meant by this? And now they got to go back to the client and find out that information. So we are valuable. We're the ones who really kind of need the answers to the questions, actually, more than even our boss does. So one thing I think we can certainly do is, if we don't have that safe space, or we haven't had that conversation with our boss yet, then maybe it's time we have to have it, because we do need to be in an environment where questions are encouraged.
Well, the other part of that is, I was just this week in a 50-person 3-day meeting.
Oh my God, sounds awful.
And there was a lot of food, a lot of snacks, right? That was good. But we were locked in a room for 3 days straight, all the same people. There were people in the room that didn't speak the whole time. And my first thought was, I'm glad the client's not here, because they would be thinking, why is that person even here?
Right.
I just paid them to sit there for 3 days and not ask any questions. Like, that would, right? So it's that was weird to me. I was one of the more vocal people, because I had a million questions, and I wanted to lob all my idea grenades, and like, hey, I got a wacky idea. Couldn't we do this? And I'm not doing it to be funny. I'm doing it because I'm legitimately intellectually curious about solving problems. And the majority of the people in that room were in the same headspace of, this is why we're here. So if you're feeling nervous about asking questions in a meeting, think of it much more in terms of the context, right? Remember, the definition of maturity is not someone who's serious all the time. The definition of maturity is someone who's able to adapt their personality based on the context. In other words, knowing when it's appropriate to ask a silly question or make a funny comment, right? That's the definition of maturity. And I've certainly been accused of being immature my whole life, but I'd like to think that I know when is a good meeting to ask, hey, I got a wacky idea. I wouldn't have done that in front of a client, right? I would want to figure that out ahead of time. So if you're feeling nervous, focus instead on the context. Is this the appropriate time to ask this particular question? And if not, write it down, and you can ask it in the car ride home too. But usually, if you feel it's contributing something or spurring a conversation, the odds are it's worthwhile for you to say that. And as you said, oftentimes other people in the room will have the same question. They just didn't ask, or forgot to, or got distracted with, whatever they're focused on. So now's the time.
Alrighty. With all that said, we are at our 15 minutes again. These go by so quick. So that is our afraid to ask questions, and hopefully we were here to help and can give you guys some advice on that. And yeah, don't be afraid to ask questions. Ask questions. We all appreciate it, and be curious, as another word that Eric said there, curiosity, intellectually curious. We should be as architects. With all that said, my name is David Doucette on behalf of Eric Corey Freed. We will see you guys on the next ARE podcast.
Thanks for listening to the ARE Podcast. Be sure to visit architectexamprep.com and check out our other podcast episodes, video tips, and the ARE blog. Remember to plan, practice, and pass.